The parking garage attendant blocked my car and said, "Your wife isn't who you think she is. Check the trunk." I stared at the old man like he'd lost his mind. He was maybe 60, wearing a faded parking garage uniform, but his eyes were sharp and desperate in a way that made my stomach drop. Before I could respond, he pressed a crumpled photograph into my hand and disappeared through a service door marked "Staff Only." I looked down at the photo and my knees nearly buckled. It showed my wife Rebecca sitting in a restaurant booth laughing, her hand intertwined with a man I'd never seen before. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the date stamp in the corner. 3 days ago, when she'd told me she was visiting her sick mother in Connecticut. My hands were shaking as I walked to the trunk of my Audi, pressed the release button, and watched it slowly rise. What I found inside made me vomit right there on the concrete floor of level B3. Beneath the spare tire cover, hidden in a compartment I didn't even know existed, were 3 burner phones, 2 thick stacks of cash held together with rubber bands, and a manila folder stuffed with documents. I grabbed the folder first, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Insurance policies. 7 of them, all with massive payouts, all listing me as the insured and Rebecca as the sole beneficiary. The total coverage exceeded $4 million, but the document that made my blood turn to ice was underneath the policies. A printed email thread between my wife and someone named Dr. M, discussing the timeline for my upcoming spinal surgery scheduled for next month. The surgery my doctor said was routine. The surgery Rebecca had been so supportive about, so insistent that I get the best care possible. The email thread detailed exactly how they planned to make sure I never woke up from anesthesia, how they would manipulate the dosages, how they would ensure that the complications looked natural and unavoidable. I don't know how long I stood there reading those emails, but every word carved another piece out of the life I thought I knew. Rebecca and Dr. M had been planning this for over a year, ever since my car accident, which suddenly didn't seem like an accident anymore. They discussed dosages and timing and how to make complications look natural. They joked about what they'd do with the money afterward, the house in Costa Rica, the life they'd build together once I was gone. Dr. M called her baby and sweetheart, and my forever love. Rebecca called him things I can't repeat, things she'd never said to me in 9 years of marriage. There were references to previous successes, to lessons learned, to a system they'd perfected together over many years. My wife wasn't just planning to kill me. She was apparently a professional at it, and I wasn't her first target. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grab the edge of the trunk to keep from collapsing. The burner phones confirmed my worst fears. One of them still had battery, and the text messages read like a horror novel written about my own life. Rebecca updated Dr. M on my medical appointments, my psychological state, my suspicions, or lack thereof. She reported that I trusted her completely, that I had no idea what was coming, that I was the perfect mark because I worked so much and paid so little attention to household details. She complained about having to sleep with me, called it her sacrifice for the cause, said she couldn't wait until it was over, and she could stop pretending to love a man she found boring and predictable. 9 years. 9 years of marriage, 2 children, thousands of shared meals and family vacations and whispered conversations in the dark. All of it performance. All of it preparation. For the moment she would collect $4 million and start her real life with a man who helped her kill people for profit. I scrolled through message after message, each one more devastating than the last, until I couldn't see through the tears blurring my vision. I photographed everything with trembling hands, checking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting Rebecca to appear and catch me discovering her secrets. The parking garage felt like a tomb, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a countdown to my own death. I needed help. I needed someone who could investigate without tipping off Rebecca, someone with resources and authority and the ability to see through the mask I'd been blind to for almost a decade. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, arranging the documents in the same order, replacing the trunk carpet, closing the lid as quietly as possible. Then I sat in my car trying to remember how to breathe, trying to process the fact that the woman I'd loved for 9 years was planning to murder me for insurance money. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Rebecca and a text asking when I'd be home for dinner. The normalcy of it made me want to scream. She was at home right now, probably cooking pasta, probably helping our daughter with homework, probably counting down the days until my surgery and her payday. I couldn't go home. But I couldn't run either, not without understanding how deep this went, not without making sure my children would be safe from whatever kind of monster their mother truly was. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? My wife has secret phones and insurance policies and emails about killing me? They'd think I was paranoid, delusional, maybe going through a mental breakdown. I needed someone who would believe me, someone who could investigate properly, someone with the resources to uncover the full truth. I called in a favor from my college roommate Kevin Park, who'd become an FBI agent specializing in financial crimes after graduating from Quantico 15 years ago. He was the only person I could think of who might take me seriously and have the ability to help. I drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign that I was being followed, and waited for Kevin to arrive. Kevin showed up 45 minutes later, looking concerned and slightly annoyed at being pulled away from his weekend. His expression changed completely when I showed him the photographs of the documents, the insurance policies, the email threads discussing my murder in clinical detail. He made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, his voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't hear, and when he hung up, his face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Michael," he said slowly, "your wife's maiden name is Rebecca Ashford, correct?" I nodded, not understanding why that mattered. He pulled up something on his phone and turned the screen toward me. "There's an open federal investigation into a woman matching your wife's description. 4 deceased husbands in 4 different states over the past 12 years. All died during medical procedures. All had substantial life insurance policies. We never had enough evidence to make an arrest because she changes her appearance and identity between marriages." The room started spinning around me, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. 4 deceased husbands. 12 years. Rebecca and I had been married for 9, which meant she'd killed at least 2 men during our relationship, probably during those trips to visit her sick mother or attend conferences for her freelance consulting work. I thought about all the times she'd traveled alone, all the business trips that lasted just a few days, all the excuses I'd accepted without question because I trusted her completely. I thought about our children, 7-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Max, and wondered if they were even mine or part of some elaborate cover story she'd constructed. The thought made me physically ill. Kevin was still talking, explaining that the FBI had identified a pattern, but never found the common thread connecting the victims until now. Different states, different causes of death, different insurance companies, different names for the wife who collected the payouts. The only similarity was that all the deceased husbands had suffered some kind of injury or illness requiring surgery in the months before their deaths, like my back injury from the car accident 3 months ago, like my upcoming spinal surgery, like the perfect setup for a murder that would look completely natural to anyone who wasn't looking for foul play. Kevin arranged for me to meet with the lead investigator on the case, Special Agent Diane Okonkwo, at a field office in Newark the following morning. I spent the night at a hotel near the airport, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of my marriage in my head. The proposal on the beach in Maine, the wedding in her parents' backyard, the birth of Sophie, then Max, the joy I'd felt holding them for the first time. Had any of it been real? Or had Rebecca been calculating insurance values and surgery timelines even as she set her vows, even as she pushed our children into the world? The woman I'd loved for 9 years was a stranger, and the stranger was apparently a serial killer who'd been planning my death since the day we met. I must have fallen asleep eventually because my alarm woke me at 6, and I drove to Newark feeling like a ghost inhabiting my own body, going through motions that no longer made sense. Agent Okonkwo was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd seen every lie ever told and wasn't interested in hearing another one. She led me to a conference room on the 3rd floor of the federal building and spread photographs across the table. 4 men who didn't look anything alike, except for the wedding rings on their left hands and the fact that they were all dead. Thomas Whitley, Phoenix, 2012, died during gallbladder surgery, age 41. Andrew Kessler, Denver, 2015, died during knee replacement recovery, age 38. James Holloway, Atlanta, 2018, died during a routine appendectomy, age 44. Peter Langford, Chicago, 2021, died during heart valve surgery, age 46. 4 men in the prime of their lives, 4 routine surgeries, 4 deaths ruled accidental, 4 massive insurance payouts collected by grieving widows who subsequently vanished. I stared at their faces and saw myself, saw the future Rebecca had planned for me, saw the gravestone with my name that would have stood in some cemetery while she spent my life insurance on a beach house with her lover. We believe the same woman was married to all of them, Agent Okonkwo said, her voice flat and professional despite the horror of what she was describing. Different names, different appearances, different cities, but the same pattern every time. She targets financially stable men in their late 30s to mid-40s, men with good jobs and good credit, and no reason to suspect that the charming woman they're dating has already buried multiple husbands. She cultivates the relationship carefully, waits for the right moment to push toward marriage, then begins the process of taking out insurance policies and arranging the circumstances of their deaths. And we believe she has a partner, someone with medical access who facilitates the actual complications that kill her husbands. The emails you found reference a Dr. M. We've been trying to identify this person for years. I showed her the photographs I'd taken, and her eyes widened as she scrolled through the evidence. This is more than we've ever had. This could finally be enough to bring her down. I spent the next 6 hours in that federal building, providing every detail I could remember about my marriage, my wife's habits, her contacts, her travel patterns, her family history, her friends, her routines. Agent Okonkwo's team cross-referenced everything with their existing investigation, and the matches started piling up with sickening precision. Rebecca's trips to visit her sick mother corresponded exactly with the dates when insurance policies were finalized for the other victims. Her consulting conferences happened in cities where the murders occurred, sometimes within days of the deaths. Phone records showed calls to burner numbers that matched patterns from previous cases, a web of communication that had been invisible until now, but suddenly formed a clear picture of coordinated murder. The woman I'd married, the mother of my children, was one of the most prolific black widows in American history, and she was weeks away from adding me to her body count. I felt like I was watching a documentary about someone else's nightmare, except the nightmare was my life. Agent Okonkwo explained what would happen next. They needed time to build an airtight case, to coordinate with law enforcement in multiple states, to ensure that when they arrested Rebecca, the charges would stick, and she couldn't escape through legal technicalities the way she apparently had before. They needed to identify Dr. M and arrest both of them simultaneously, to prevent either from warning the other or destroying evidence. And they needed me to go home and act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed, to be the unsuspecting husband for a few more weeks while they prepared the trap. The thought of returning to that house, of sitting across the dinner table from a woman who was planning to kill me, of sleeping in the same bed where she probably fantasized about collecting my life insurance, made me want to run and never stop. But I understood the logic. If Rebecca suspected anything, she would disappear like she'd done before, change her name and appearance, find another victim, continue her killing spree indefinitely. The only way to stop her was to catch her completely off guard. They gave me a panic button disguised as a car key fob, small enough to keep in my pocket at all times, powerful enough to summon federal agents within minutes if I pressed it. They installed tracking software on my phone that would alert the surveillance team if I deviated from expected patterns or if my phone stopped moving for an extended period. They coached me on how to act normal, how to avoid micro-expressions that might trigger suspicion, how to have conversations about my upcoming surgery without letting the terror show in my voice. Agent Okonkwo was surprisingly gentle as she explained the psychological techniques for maintaining a facade, and I realized she'd probably had this conversation before with other people whose lives had been shattered by similar revelations. "You can do this," she said, meeting my eyes with steady conviction. "You've already done the hardest part by discovering the truth. Now you just have to be patient while we do our jobs." I nodded, but inside I felt like a man walking to his own execution, just with a slightly delayed timeline. I drove home that evening feeling like I was entering enemy territory. The house looked the same as it always had, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a wraparound porch and garden beds that Rebecca maintained with meticulous care. The same house where we'd carried our children through the front door for the first time. The same house where we'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and ordinary Sunday mornings. The same house where my wife had probably calculated how much my death would be worth and decided it was finally time to collect. Rebecca met me at the door with a smile that I now recognized as performance, a carefully constructed expression designed to put me at ease. She asked about my medical appointment, and I heard the question differently now, heard her checking on the timeline, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. I told her the doctor was optimistic about the surgery, that I expected a full recovery, and I watched something flicker behind her eyes that might have been disappointment, or might have been my imagination working overtime. Dinner was chicken parmesan, my favorite, and I wondered if she'd made it specifically to keep me happy and unsuspecting. Sophie chattered about her science project, while Max made a mess with his garlic bread, and I looked at my children and felt my heart crack into pieces. They had no idea that their mother was a monster, that the woman who tucked them in at night and packed their lunches had killed multiple men and was planning to kill their father. What would happen to them when Rebecca was arrested? Would they understand? Would they ever recover from the trauma of learning the truth about who she really was? I forced myself to eat, to smile, to participate in the normal family rhythms that had suddenly become a minefield of hidden meanings and secret dangers. Rebecca's hand brushed mine as she passed the salad, and I had to suppress a shudder at her touch. This woman wants me dead, I thought. This woman has killed before and will kill again if I don't stop her. The thought played on repeat in my head throughout the meal. That night, lying in bed beside Rebecca while she slept, I stared at the ceiling and counted her breaths. In and out, slow and peaceful, the breathing of someone with a clear conscience and no remorse. How was that possible? How could someone plan murder with such cold calculation and then sleep like an innocent child? I thought about the other husbands, Thomas and Andrew and James and Peter, lying in beds just like this one, trusting the women beside them, never imagining that their wives were counting down to their deaths. Had they suspected anything? Had there been moments when something felt wrong, some instinct that tried to warn them? Or had they been as blind as I was, as completely fooled by the performance of love? I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I existed in a state of suspended terror, going through the motions of my life while waiting for the trap to close around the woman who had made that life a lie. Agent Okonkwo called me on the 4th day with news that changed everything. "We found Thomas Whitley's sister," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "She's been investigating your wife for 11 years, ever since her brother died in Phoenix. She has evidence we didn't know existed, including financial records that trace payments between your wife and Dr. M through a series of shell companies. And Michael?" She paused, and I heard her take a breath. "We've identified Dr. M. His real name is Marcus Vance. He's a disgraced anesthesiologist who lost his license for malpractice in 2010, and he's been working with your wife since at least 2011. We have surveillance on him now, We're ready to move. I felt a wave of relief so intense, it made me dizzy. Finally, this nightmare would be over. Then Agent Okonkwo said something that turned the relief to ice. There's one more thing. The financial records show payments going back further than we thought, to a time before your marriage. We think your car accident 3 months ago wasn't an accident. We think they arranged it to create the medical condition that would justify your surgery. The car accident. I remembered it clearly, or thought I did. A rainy night, poor visibility, a truck that ran a red light and clipped the back of my car, sending me spinning into a guardrail. The other driver had fled the scene, never identified despite police investigation. I'd spent 2 weeks in the hospital with spinal injuries that required extensive rehabilitation and would eventually need surgical correction. Rebecca had been devoted during my recovery, sleeping in the hospital room, managing my medications, researching the best surgeons, being the perfect supportive wife, and now I understood why. She hadn't been taking care of me. She'd been protecting her investment, making sure I survived long enough to be worth killing properly. The truck that hit me was probably driven by Marcus Vance or someone he hired. The whole thing had been orchestrated, from the accident to the injury to the surgery that would serve as cover for my murder. They'd been planning this for months, maybe years, waiting for the right moment to execute their scheme. The arrest happened 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon while the kids were at school. I'd taken the day off work, claiming I needed rest before my surgery, and I was sitting in an FBI surveillance van parked 2 blocks from my house when the tactical teams moved in. They hit both locations simultaneously, our house in Ridgewood and Marcus Vance's apartment in Philadelphia. Coordinated raids designed to prevent either suspect from warning the other. I watched on the monitors as agents swarmed my property, as Rebecca was led out in handcuffs wearing the blue sundress I'd always loved, as she screamed my name and begged for help with a desperation that sounded almost genuine. But I knew better now. I knew every word from her mouth was calculated, every expression practiced, every emotion performed for maximum effect. She kept screaming until she saw the surveillance van, until she understood that I was watching, and then her face changed completely. The mask dropped, and I saw something cold and reptilian in her eyes, something that had been hidden behind the loving wife performance for 9 years. That was her real face, the predator beneath the persona. Marcus Vance didn't go quietly. He barricaded himself in his apartment and refused to surrender for almost 2 hours, threatening to destroy evidence, demanding immunity deals, ranting about how they'd never be able to prove anything. Eventually, the tactical team breached the door and took him into custody without injuries, but the delay had allowed him to delete files from his computer and shred documents that might have contained additional evidence. It didn't matter. The case against both of them was already overwhelming, built from the insurance records and financial traces and the testimony of surviving family members from their previous victims. Thomas Whitley's sister had accumulated 11 years of evidence that the FBI had never seen, including recorded phone conversations where Rebecca discussed her methods with Marcus, planning sessions where they selected targets and refined their techniques. The prosecution would have more than enough to secure convictions on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The investigation that followed the arrests revealed horrors beyond anything I'd imagined. Rebecca and Marcus had been partners for almost 15 years, meeting at a medical conference in Las Vegas shortly after Marcus lost his license. They'd developed their system through trial and error, learning from early mistakes, becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect with each successful murder. The total body count was at least 6 confirmed deaths, possibly more that hadn't been identified yet. Insurance payouts totaled over $15 million, split between them through an elaborate network of shell companies and offshore accounts. They'd use the money to fund comfortable lives in multiple cities, maintaining separate residences, separate identities, separate pools of potential victims. Rebecca had been married to me and simultaneously engaged to another man in California, a software engineer named David, who'd recently been diagnosed with a heart condition requiring surgery. The FBI arrested Rebecca's confederate in that scheme before she could complete the murder, saving David's life without him ever knowing how close he'd come to death. But the revelation that destroyed me completely came from the DNA testing the FBI conducted as part of their investigation. Sophie was my biological daughter, confirmed by genetic analysis, my flesh and blood, the one true thing in my marriage of lies. But Max wasn't mine. His biological father was Marcus Vance, conceived during one of Rebecca's trips to Philadelphia, carried to term while she shared my bed and let me believe I was becoming a father for the second time. I remembered the pregnancy, the ultrasounds, the baby shower where my parents cried with joy, the delivery room where I held Rebecca's hand and told her she was the strongest person I knew. All of it performance, all of it deception designed to deepen my investment in the marriage, to make me more vulnerable, to ensure I'd never suspect the woman who'd given me 2 beautiful children. Except she hadn't given me 2 children. She'd given me one and passed off her lover's child as mine, a living reminder of her betrayal that I'd been raising for 5 years without knowing the truth. I didn't know how to process the revelation about Max. He was 5 years old, innocent, completely unaware that the father who read him bedtime stories and taught him to ride a bike wasn't actually his father. He called me Daddy with complete trust, climbed into my lap for comfort when he was scared, looked at me like I was his hero, Could I stop loving him because of something he had no control over? Could I punish a child for his mother's sins? The therapist the FBI provided helped me work through the impossible emotions, the grief and rage and profound sense of violation. She reminded me that biology doesn't determine fatherhood, that the bond I'd built with Max was real even if it was founded on lies, that he needed me now more than ever because his entire world was about to collapse. I made my decision before the trial started. Max was my son. He would always be my son. The circumstances of his conception didn't change the 5 years I'd spent loving him, and they wouldn't change the future I intended to give him. The trial began in October and lasted 4 months, filling newspapers and cable news shows with stories that seemed too evil to be real. Prosecutors presented evidence methodically, building a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. Insurance company executives testified about the policies and payouts. Medical examiners from 4 states testified about the deaths and the suspicious patterns they'd noticed but couldn't prove. Family members of the victims testified about their loved ones, about the women who'd married them and killed them, about the grief that never fully healed. Thomas Whitley's sister took the stand for 3 days, presenting the evidence she'd accumulated over 11 years. The financial records and phone recordings and surveillance photos that proved Rebecca and Marcus had been operating as a murder-for-profit team since 2011. The jury sat in stunned silence as the scope of the crimes became clear, as the faces of the dead appeared on screens, as the emails and text messages revealed the cold calculation behind each killing. I testified for 2 days, describing what I'd found in the trunk, what I'd learned about my marriage, what it felt like to realize that 9 years of love had been a carefully constructed lie designed to end with my death. The defense attorneys tried to shake my testimony, suggesting that I'd misinterpreted the evidence, that Rebecca had been manipulated by Marcus, that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. But the emails spoke for themselves. Rebecca wasn't a follower. She was the mastermind, the one who selected targets and cultivated relationships and decided when it was time to collect the insurance payouts. She'd been killing men for money since before we met, and she would have kept killing if the parking garage attendant hadn't found the courage to warn me. I looked at her across the courtroom as I testified, searching for any trace of the woman I'd thought I married, but her face was blank, unreadable, a mask hiding whatever cold machinery operated beneath. She stared back at me with eyes I no longer recognized, and I felt nothing but relief that I would never have to look into those eyes again. Rebecca's defense strategy collapsed when Marcus Vance took a plea deal in exchange for testimony against her. He admitted everything: the murders, the insurance fraud, the arrangement they'd maintained for 15 years, the plans they'd made for my death and for David in California and for victims they hadn't yet selected. He described Rebecca as the dominant partner, the strategist, the one who decided which men to target and when to execute the schemes. He explained that she'd approached him at the medical conference, had recognized something in him that matched something in her, had proposed the partnership that would make them both wealthy through systematic murder. His testimony was clinical, detailed, utterly damning, and it removed any possibility that Rebecca could claim she'd been coerced or manipulated. The jury convicted her on all counts after only 4 hours of deliberation, and when the verdict was read, she finally showed emotion for the first time since her arrest. Not remorse or regret, but rage, pure and concentrated, directed at me and at Marcus, and at the system that had finally caught her after all these years of successful predation. The judge sentenced Rebecca to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She would die in prison, never touching freedom again, never having the opportunity to target another victim. Marcus Vance received 4 consecutive life terms in exchange for his cooperation, a deal that still felt too lenient, given the number of lives he'd helped end. The families of the victims were present for the sentencing, filling 3 rows of the courtroom, united in their grief and their satisfaction that justice had finally been served. I sat with Thomas Whitley's sister, a woman named Patricia, who'd become something like a friend during the months of investigation and trial. She'd lost her brother to Rebecca's schemes, had dedicated 11 years of her life to pursuing justice, had been dismissed as obsessed and paranoid by law enforcement who couldn't see the pattern she'd identified. When the sentences were announced, she grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard I thought my bones might break. "We got them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We finally got them." The aftermath of the trial forced me to rebuild my entire life from the ground up. The house in Ridgewood was sold, the proceeds divided between legal fees and establishing trust funds for the children. We moved to a smaller place in a different town, somewhere without memories of Rebecca, somewhere we could start over. Sophie struggled hardest with the transition, old enough at 7 to understand that her mother was a murderer, young enough to be devastated by the betrayal. She required years of therapy to process the trauma, to separate her love for the mother she'd known from her horror at the mother who actually existed. Some nights, she still woke up screaming, calling for a mother who would never come, and I would hold her and rock her and promise that everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure I believed it. Max adapted more easily because he was younger, because his memories of Rebecca were already fading into something vague and distant. He still didn't know about Marcus Vance, and I decided to wait until he was older to explain the truth about his biological father. He needed stability more than he needed information that would only confuse and hurt him. The parking garage attendant who'd saved my life was named Bernard Holloway. I learned his identity during the trial, when he was called as a witness to describe how he'd approached me and what he'd said. He was James Holloway's younger brother, the brother of Rebecca's third victim, and he'd spent 5 years tracking her after his brother's death in Atlanta. He'd taught himself investigation techniques, followed digital trails across multiple states, worked various jobs at locations where Rebecca or her targets were likely to appear. When he learned about me and my upcoming surgery, he'd gotten himself hired at the hospital parking garage and waited for the right moment to approach. He'd been rehearsing what to say for months, terrified that I would dismiss him as crazy, knowing that if his warning failed, another innocent man would die. The courage it must have taken to step out from behind that pillar and shatter a stranger's world with 9 words was almost unimaginable. He'd risked everything to save me, and I owed him my life. I met Bernard for coffee after the trial ended, wanting to thank him properly, needing to understand how he'd seen through the mask that had fooled me for 9 years. He was smaller than I remembered from the parking garage, older somehow, worn down by the years of grief and obsession that had consumed his life since James died, but his eyes were clear now, peaceful in a way they probably hadn't been for a very long time. He told me about James, about the brother he'd idolized, about the devastation of losing him to a woman who'd seemed so perfect, so loving, so completely devoted. He told me about the guilt of not being able to save him, about the rage that had nearly destroyed him, about the decision to dedicate his life to preventing another death, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. I didn't know if I could actually do it, he admitted, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When I saw you in the parking garage, I almost lost my nerve. You looked so happy, so confident, like your life was perfect, and I was about to destroy it. But then I thought about James, about how happy he'd been before Rebecca killed him, and I knew I couldn't let it happen again. Bernard became an unexpected source of comfort in the months that followed. We met regularly, 2 men bound by the same predator, survivors of a nightmare that no one else could fully understand. He told me stories about James that made his brother feel real, made me grieve for a man I'd never met, made me understand the full human cost of Rebecca's crimes. I told him about my marriage, about the red flags I'd missed, about the moments that made horrible sense in retrospect. We compared notes like veterans of the same war, finding comfort in being understood, in having our experiences validated by someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be deceived so completely. When Bernard finally decided to move on with his life, to stop being defined by his brother's murder and his pursuit of justice, I was genuinely happy for him. He'd given me my life. Watching him reclaim his own felt like the only kind of justice that truly mattered. 3 years after the conviction, I received a letter from Rebecca in prison. I almost burned it unopened, the way I'd burned every other piece of correspondence she'd attempted to send, but something made me read it this time. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I was finally strong enough to face whatever manipulation she had left to attempt. The letter was 6 pages of carefully constructed victimhood, full of explanations and excuses, and attempts to rewrite the history we'd shared. She claimed she'd loved me, really loved me, that I was different from the other husbands, that she'd been trying to find a way out of her partnership with Marcus when everything fell apart. She blamed her childhood, her first husband who'd been abusive, the circumstances that had pushed her toward Marcus, and the life of crime they'd built together. She asked about the children, asked me to bring them to visit, asked for forgiveness with words that felt rehearsed even on paper. She even suggested that we could still be a family someday, that prison couldn't erase what we'd built, that the kids needed their mother regardless of what she'd done. I read the letter 3 times, searching for any hint of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of the lives she'd destroyed, any recognition that her actions had consequences beyond her own inconvenience. There was nothing. Even in her supposed confession, she positioned herself as the victim, the one who'd been wronged by circumstance and bad luck and partners who'd taken advantage of her vulnerabilities. The 6 men she'd killed were mentioned only briefly, dismissed as unfortunate necessities, collateral damage in a life that had given her no other choices. My near murder was described as a misunderstanding, a plan that had gotten out of control, something she'd never really intended to go through with. The denial was so complete, so utterly disconnected from reality, that I finally understood something I'd been struggling to accept since her arrest. Rebecca wasn't capable of remorse because she wasn't capable of seeing other people as real. We were all props in her performance, objects to be used and discarded, means to ends that only mattered to her. I shredded the letter and threw it away, and I never read another one. The parking garage where everything started was renovated 2 years after the trial, transformed into a modern structure with better lighting and automated payment systems. Bernard lost his job there during the renovation, but he didn't seem to mind. He'd accomplished what he came to do, had finally achieved the justice he'd been seeking for 5 years, had saved at least one life, and helped put his brother's killer behind bars forever. I drove past the construction site once, watching the old structure come down, remembering the moment when Bernard stepped out from behind that concrete pillar and changed everything with a photograph and 9 words. If I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later, if he'd lost his nerve, if I'd dismissed him as crazy and driven home to my wife, I would be dead now. The surgery would have happened, the complications would have been fatal, and Rebecca would be spending my insurance money on a beach somewhere while my children grew up believing their mother loved them. The randomness of survival haunted me sometimes, the thin margin between life and death, the countless small decisions that had aligned to keep me alive when so many others had died. I remarried 5 years after the trial, to a woman named Grace who knew everything about my past and loved me despite it. She was a social worker specializing in trauma recovery, someone who understood damaged people and broken families without needing extensive explanations. She'd read about my case in the newspapers, had followed the trial with the rest of the country, and when we met at a grief support group for families affected by violent crime, she already knew the basics of what I'd survived. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, with none of the whirlwind romance that had characterized my courtship with Rebecca. I was too damaged for grand gestures, too suspicious of anything that felt too perfect, too aware of how easily love could be faked by someone with the right skills and motivation. Grace understood my caution and never pushed for more than I could give. She earned my trust gradually, through consistency and honesty and the willingness to sit with me through dark nights when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. Grace became a stepmother to Sophie and Max, patient and gentle with children who'd been traumatized by their biological mother's crimes. She never tried to replace Rebecca, never asked them to call her mom, never demanded affection they weren't ready to give. Instead, she simply showed up, day after day, proving through her actions that she could be trusted, that love could be real, that not everyone who entered their lives would eventually betray them. Sophie took years to warm up to her, the wound of her mother's betrayal too deep for easy healing, but eventually she opened her heart to the woman who'd helped her father rebuild his life. Max adapted more quickly, young enough that he barely remembered Rebecca, grateful for a maternal presence that felt safe and constant. The family we built together wasn't what I'd imagined when I was younger, wasn't the perfect nuclear unit I'd thought I had with Rebecca, but it was real in a way that mattered more than perfection ever could. I told Max the truth about his biological father when he turned 18, sitting him down in the living room of our new house and explaining the complicated circumstances of his conception. He took it better than I expected, or maybe I just underestimated his resilience after everything else he'd already survived. He asked questions I tried to answer honestly, about Marcus Vance and what kind of person he was, about whether the capacity for evil was genetic, about what it meant for his identity that his biological father was a murderer. I told him that biology doesn't determine destiny, that the choices we make define who we are, that 5 years of Marcus's DNA mattered less than 18 years of being my son. He cried, and I cried, and Grace sat with us and held our hands while we processed the weight of a truth that had been waiting for this moment since before he was born. When it was over, Max hugged me and said thank you for being my dad anyway, and I knew that whatever else Rebecca had taken from me, she hadn't taken this. 15 years after the parking garage, I testified at a parole hearing. Rebecca had somehow accumulated enough good behavior credits and manipulated enough prison officials to request early release consideration, claiming rehabilitation and posing no further threat to society. The prosecutor asked me to speak about why her request should be denied, and I sat in that hearing room across from the woman I'd once loved, looked into eyes that had fooled me for 9 years, and told the truth. I told them about Sophie's nightmares that still occasionally surfaced, about Max's therapy sessions that continued into adulthood, about the fear that lingered in every relationship I'd formed since discovering what lurked beneath the surface of my marriage. I told them about Bernard Holloway and Patricia Whitley and all the other family members who'd lost loved ones to this woman's greed. I told them about the dead men who couldn't be here to testify, whose voices had been silenced forever by the person sitting across from me, pretending to be reformed. The parole board denied her request unanimously, and as corrections officers led Rebecca back to her cell, she turned and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen during our marriage or even during the trial. Pure hatred, undiluted and absolute, the mask finally completely gone. She mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass partition, but her lips clearly formed the words, "This isn't over." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't look away. I held her gaze until she was out of sight, letting her see that I wasn't afraid anymore, that the man who'd discovered her secrets in a parking garage trunk had become someone she could no longer manipulate or intimidate. She would spend the rest of her life in that prison, and I would spend the rest of mine making sure she never forgot who put her there. Bernard Holloway died 8 years ago, peacefully in his sleep at 71, surrounded by the family he'd finally allowed himself to build after spending so many years consumed by revenge. I spoke at his funeral, told the story of how he'd saved my life, how his courage and persistence had prevented at least one murder and helped bring a serial killer to justice. His children, whom I'd watched grow up through Christmas cards and occasional visits, thanked me for being part of their father's healing, for giving him a success to balance against the failure of not being able to save his brother. I thought about James Holloway often after that, about the brother who died too young, about what his life might have been if he'd never met the woman who called herself his wife. Bernard's grave is next to James's now, the two brothers reunited in death, their headstones bearing dates that tell a story of tragedy and redemption and the fierce loyalty of family bonds that even murder couldn't completely sever. 20 years have passed since that day in the parking garage, and I still check trunks. I still verify identities. I still trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even when I can't explain why. Sophie is 33 now, a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, channeling her childhood trauma into protecting others from predators who hide behind charming facades. Max is 31, a psychologist working with families affected by parental incarceration, helping other children process the same complicated grief he'd navigated with help from Grace and years of therapy. Both of them know the full truth about their origins, about their mother, and about Max's biological father, and both of them have made peace with it in their own ways. They call Grace Mom and mean it. They visit Rebecca's grave once a year, because she died in prison 6 years ago from cancer that spread too fast for treatment, and they feel something complicated standing there that isn't quite grief and isn't quite relief and isn't quite anything they can easily name. I don't go to Rebecca's grave. I've said everything I need to say to the woman who almost killed me, and none of it requires standing over her bones. The last time I saw her alive was at that parole hearing, when she looked at me with hatred so pure it felt like a physical force. She died still believing she was the victim, still maintaining that she'd been misunderstood, still convinced that the world had treated her unfairly by holding her accountable for the lives she'd taken. The prison chaplain who was present at her death told me she asked for me in her final hours, wanted to see me one last time, had something she needed to say. I didn't go. I couldn't give her that final performance, couldn't let her use her last breaths to attempt one more manipulation. Whatever she wanted to tell me died with her, and I've never once regretted not hearing it. Grace and I celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary last month, a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we had our first official date, back when I was still learning to trust, and she was patiently proving that she was worth trusting. She's 63 now, retired from social work, spending her days gardening and spoiling our grandchildren, and occasionally traveling to places she'd always wanted to see. I'm 62, still working part-time at my architecture firm, designing buildings I'll probably never see completed, planning for a future I once wasn't sure I'd have. We talk about Rebecca sometimes, about the years I spent married to a murderer, about the children we raised together, and the scars that will never fully heal. Grace never minimizes what happened, never suggests I should be over it by now, never makes me feel weak for still sometimes waking up in cold sweats from dreams where the parking garage attendant never appeared and I drove home to my death. The world has mostly forgotten about the Ashford case, moved on to newer horrors and fresher scandals that dominate the news cycles. But I remember. The families of Thomas Whitley and Andrew Kessler and James Holloway and Peter Langford remember. Patricia Whitley still sends me Christmas cards, updates on her grandchildren and her garden, and the life she's built in the years since she finally achieved justice for her brother. We are the keepers of this particular nightmare, the witnesses to a truth that most people prefer not to think about, that monsters wear human faces, that they marry us and have our children and plan our deaths while asking about our day. The evil that Rebecca represented didn't die with her. There are others out there, other predators hunting for victims, other performances of love concealing calculations of profit and death. I can't save them all. I can't even save most of them. But I can tell this story, can warn others to trust their instincts, can maybe plant a seed of suspicion that saves one life the way Bernard Holloway's warning saved mine. Last week, my grandson asked me why I always check the car so carefully before we drive anywhere. He's 8 years old, curious about everything, too young to understand the darkness that exists in the world, but old enough to notice patterns in the adults around him. I told him it's just a habit, something Grandpa does, and he accepted the answer with the easy trust of childhood. But someday, I'll tell him the real story. Someday, when he's old enough to understand, I'll explain that his grandfather almost died before his father was born, that the woman in the old photographs was a monster wearing a human mask, that survival sometimes depends on the courage of strangers and the willingness to believe impossible truths. I'll tell him about Bernard Holloway, about Patricia Whitley, about all the people who refused to let evil go unchallenged, even when the cost was years of their lives and pieces of their souls. And I'll tell him the most important lesson I learned in that parking garage 20 years ago. When someone tries to warn you about danger, listen, check the trunk. The life you save might be your own. The parking garage attendant blocked my car and said, "Your wife isn't who you think she is. Check the trunk." I listened. I survived. I spent 20 years rebuilding everything she tried to destroy, and if telling this story saves even one person from the fate she planned for me, then every moment of pain was worth it.